Can you give me a rough idea of what happens when the needle jabs into your arm that ends up resulting in something happening in your brain that correlates with or corresponds to the subjective experience of pain and suffering?
So most people who study it there are pain nerves.
Nociceptors?
Yes, nociceptors.
Nociceptors.
And there's tons of different kinds. It's the most diverse set of peripheral nerves. Lots of different categories, and there's, temperature, and there's extreme cold, which is a type of pain, and extreme heat, and then there's sharp pain, which is transmitted through very fast fibers, and there's the sort of dull, throbbing pain transmitted through very slow fibers, and all kinds of other things that people have studied in the periphery. That is not pain. That's the peripheral signaling mechanism. And obviously that's not pain, because if you have all the nerves perfectly intact, but then you sever their connection to the brain, the person doesn't feel any pain, right? That's not the same thing as pain. So then they get into the brain and they make their central connections.
I would just like to point out that you made, to me, a very interesting observation, because I have been pondering over, for instance, whether or not certain types of shrimp feel pain. And yes, they have nociceptors, but they don't have a brain. The type that I'm looking at, they don't have a centralized nervous system, at least. But that just popped into my brain. But please keep going.
I mean, I think you're right. I don't think shrimp feel pain. I don't think shrimp feel in the same sense that we understand the word. I don't think they have those same self-models that we have. It's possible they have some really simple precursor versions, but I suspect not. But that would be for further study.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to the shrimp. I'm sorry for throwing you off the track. But okay, so the pain hits or not the pain, but because there's no pain yet. Needle hits arm.
Yeah.
Nociceptors send signal up to the neck. If the spinal cord is severed, there's no pain, but suppose it's intact.
Right. So now there's these central connections, and there's tons of them. There's connections for pain. Actually, the first connection is in the spinal cord. There's a secondary neuron, and then that goes up to the brain. The secondary neuron synapses, there's a place in something called the thalamus, where there's another synapse, where the neurons come in and they connect to the third neuron in line. And then the third neuron goes all over the brain and branches out, and there's cortical areas that receive information, right? So all of this is processing information about events on the surface of the skin.
When you say that there's a secondary and then a tertiary neuron, do you literally mean that there is one neuron, or there's a type of neuron and it's actually like 1,000 or 1,000,000 neurons that are getting activated right here and then moving into the
So they're millions, but they're in parallel.
Okay.
So you can literally trace a single neuron, if you wanted to, from your foot all the way up to your spinal cord. Like, that's one really long neuron. It's very, very thin, single cell connecting your foot to your upper spinal cord. And yet there's, of course, millions of those all in parallel with each other. And you activate one of them and you should be able to feel the pain ultimately. But normally you're activating many of them. Yes. So that's the first neuron in line that connects your foot to your or whatever, your arm to your the spinal cord, first relay, so to speak, in the pain sequence. And the second bundle of neurons goes from the spinal cord up into the thalamus, which is this central structure in the brain. The thalamus is serves the cortex. It's this thing like the pit at the heart of the cortical outer covering, and it evolved with the cortex, and it grew massively as the cortex grew. So it's part of that whole machinery. And then the third set of neurons transmits from the thalamus up into the cortex in really rich, complicated ways. And pain branches out all over the place. There's lots and lots of other areas in the brain that process pain. But there is and most people who study pain perception study that. They're studying the representations of it. They're studying how the information is represented and coded. That is not the same thing as subjective experience, which is that's a component that you typically don't find in studies of pain, right? Those are much more anchored to the nuts and bolts. But you do have this final layer, which is the subjective experience itself. And so in theory, it's possible to have all those mechanisms in operation, active, crackling away, firing away, and yet not have that final subjective experience component active. And then you don't feel pain. Then you're like the proverbial zombie. The machinery is there, but the experiential component is missing. But I would say what's missing is the final stage of self-models that allows you to say, I am a person and I'm feeling this right now, and I don't like it, right? That final stage of self-model could be missing. So that's what I think is involved. There's layers on layers of processing, and the raw nociceptive input is processed in very complex ways, and then experience itself is processed in a different way. And when all of those are stacked on top of each other, that's when you get someone saying, this is awful, I feel pain, and I don't like the experience.